Julia had honor, virtue, truth, and love for Don Alfonso, and she inly swore by all the vows below to powers above she never would disgrace the ring she wore, nor leave a wish which wisdom might reprove. And while she pondered this, besides much more, one hand on Juan's carelessly was thrown, quite by mistake. She thought it was her own. Unconsciously, she leaned upon the other hand of Juan, which played within the tangles of her hair, and to contend with thoughts she could not smother, she seemed, by the distraction of her air. 'Twas surely very wrong in Juan's mother to leave together this imprudent pair, she who for many years had watched her son so. I'm very certain mine would not have done so. The hand which still held Juan's by degrees gently but palpably confirmed its grasp, as if it said, "Detain me if you please." Yet there's no doubt she only meant to clasp his fingers with a pure platonic squeeze. She would have shrunk as from a toad or asp had she imagined such a thing could rouse a feeling dangerous to a prudent spouse. I cannot know what Juan thought of this, but what he did is much what you would do. His young lip thanked it with a grateful kiss, and then, abashed at its own joy, withdrew in deep despair, lest he had done amiss. Love is so very timid when 'tis new. She blushed and frowned not, but she strove to speak and held her tongue. Her voice was grown so weak. And Julia sate with Juan, half embraced and half retiring from the glowing arm which trembled like the bosom where 'twas placed. Yet still she must have thought there was no harm, or else 'twere easy to withdraw her waist. But then the situation had its charm, and then God knows what next. I can't go on. I'm almost sorry that I e'er begun. And Julia's voice was lost, except in sighs, until too late for useful conversation. The tears were gushing from her gentle eyes. I wish indeed they had not had occasion, but who, alas, can love and then be wise? Not that remorse did not oppose temptation. A little still she strove, and much repented, and whispering, "I will ne'er consent," consented. It's hard to believe that this was written nearly 200 years before that word consent, not to mention affirmative consent, became such a major plank of feminist activism and indeed of sexual assault law in Canada, and I hope not, but perhaps soon to be in the United States. One suspects, unfortunately, that in our time, a properly trained judge or jury would find that the 16-year-old boy in this scenario had sexually assaulted the woman, whose sexually inviting behavior would be considered nullified by her non-consenting words. The scene is remarkable, among other reasons, for showing us why the feminist mantra, yes means yes and no means no, is such a flawed standard for separating the licit from the illicit. And Byron knew this as well as we do, and yet we continue to pretend not to.
Firstly, what was your highlight of this conference? It doesn't have to be a talk per se, but just what's your best memory of this weekend?
There's so many. Let's see. I enjoyed so many of the talks. I really liked Don Dutton's presentation. I don't know if you saw it. About he basically did a survey of all the major polls and research done on domestic violence from the mid-1970s on, that have shown that the narrative that most people in the general public accept about the violent man and the non-violent woman victim, that accounts for only about 5% of all the cases of domestic violence that have been studied in serious studies. It was definitive.
Okay, no, I didn't see that.
It was fantastic, and he brought together all the studies, all the major, what they call meta-analyses, where they look at hundreds of other studies. It was really just incredibly good, and so that was one that was just really useful. You just think, if I just have that document of his talk, I can counter so much that is false in general discussions about violence and gender in the general public sphere. So that was one, and then I just saw now. It was so sad. There were only a few people there because there's so much else that's good going on. But it was by the creator of he's the company CEO of Agard Watches.
Yes.
And he did his own little video about how he came to make the video in response to the Gillette ad.
Yes.
And then he did another one about fathers. And he's become a major men's issues advocate. And he gave the most amazing little, what seemed to be a completely off-the-cuff, I don't think he had a script or anything, off-the-cuff little talk for us, which unfortunately only 5 people saw, talking about how for a long time he'd been aware of the anti-male, public culture, and he'd seen friends of his who were going through divorces and losing custody of their children, seeing the pain that they experience. He'd become very interested in the fact that often following a divorce, if men lose custody of their children, that they experience depression, alcoholism, and often suicide. And so he started to think about these issues. And then he said when he saw that Gillette ad, it was the final straw.
Yes.
And he stayed up all night and made his response to it. And it's just a beautiful response about what is a man.
Yes.
And he said that everybody else in the company was in support of it, but actually afraid to take a public stance. So for a while he was thinking of just releasing it, personally, not as Agard Watches, but I guess eventually he talked the other members of the company into putting the name of Agard to it. And anyway, it was just a really inspiring, and this is now something that he's going to do. He's inviting everybody to make videos, there's very short videos about a significant positive male figure in their lives, to send them to him.
Brilliant.
And then Agard is gonna, as he says, blast them out to his 60,000 person mailing list.
Brilliant.
Like, he's really interested in changing the public cultural perception of masculinity.
I'm relatively familiar with his story, and those sort of reactions are so positive, particularly because you're saying that in the business sphere.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There's such an element of...
he could have such a massive impact. It made me think, I'm going to buy as many Agard watches as I possibly can. Because one of the things he wants to be able to say, too, to other companies, because he's been at these discussions with other major business leaders, and they're all on the SJW bandwagon. You have to take a stand, you have to be a women's advocate, and all of this, and so he's trying to provide the other side of things, and if he can convince even a few major companies that he had an uptick, a significant uptick in sales and public appreciation,
I was going to ask,
that'd be great.
Did he have any, kind of data?
He said that he didn't want to release precise data, but that there was an increase in sales, but not a really huge one. And so for a period of about a month, they saw a significant increase.
So it certainly wasn't a negative impact.
It wasn't a negative, no. And he said he got a lot of positive emails from people saying they appreciated the ad, and he did get some negative ones too. Sure. Disputing the statistics and calling him a rape apologist and all the usual stuff. But overwhelmingly it was positive, and there was some increase in sales as well. But he said it would be great, if he could say, that we had $1 million increase in sales, and I was able to give much more to charity as a result, or something like that.
But it is. That's a positive story, because it is quite it's a niche product, or not niche product, but it's not something. it's not the sort of thing like a razor blade that
Right.
you know, go every day.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you, because probably one of the reasons there were so few is because they were having that conversation about the Gillette adverts in the main room,
Right.
with Carl Benjamin and, you know, Dankula, some of the big names.
Yeah.
And kind of one of the things, I mean, I'm curious about your opinion on this. Obviously, the numbers are in for Gillette, and they lost a considerable.
Yeah.
They lost billions. And it was been mentioned also that it wasn't just sort of, you know, it was about reputational damage as well, the impact on the name Gillette, you know, so how much that's costing them. Their sort of position on this is that it was worth it because they're going for the younger market.
Right.
Now, obviously, that could just be old talk. I'm curious, do you think there's any validity to that?
Hard to say. It's
Okay.
hard to say. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly young people, you know, one segment of young people that I've come into contact with at university seem to be pretty much on board with the feminist message.
Yeah.
I would say that overwhelmingly, I teach English, so sorts of students who tend to go into English literature maybe are more susceptible to all that leftist and feminist messaging.
Yeah.
But I would say, there's a lot of support for the angry feminist, you know, exhortation, the conviction that women have been treated badly for a long time, and that now it's the time of the women,
Yes.
and the men have to step back and have to support their women and have to accept that their own lives. Their own life choices are going to become limited, but that's a good thing because they should be supporting women, and that is the public line that most university students, I think, know. They know that that's what they should be supporting, and so a lot of them believe it. I think a significant number of people don't really believe it, especially young men, but feel they can't say.
We don't know to what extent Byron's comic portrait was intended to have wide sociological or personal import. We do know that Byron's own experiences as a child and boy may have led him to a heightened awareness of male sexual vulnerability, as well as of the hypocrisy that surrounded ideas of feminine virtue. Byron had grown up without a father. His father had died, or it's possible that he killed himself in France when Byron was very young. And he was raised by a violent and verbally abusive mother who harshly blamed and condemned her only child as his father's son. And we have the letters that the young Byron wrote about the deep distress that she caused him by what he called her, quote, violent paroxysms of rage so disproportionate to the cause. She told him, amongst other things, that he would become exactly like his father, a dissolute, cruel, irresponsible scoundrel. At times, she smothered him with affection. At other times, she burst out in verbal and physical fury, and Byron never knew which it would be, and as a result, he developed a terror of female emotional volatility. Compounding his mother's abusiveness, between the ages of 9 and 11, Byron was emotionally and sexually molested by the family nursemaid, someone who biographers have described as a drunken, violent madwoman who took him to her bed to teach him about religion. The experience led him from an early age to define his identity self-destructively through transgressive affairs, sexual acting out, with many sexual partners, both men and women, including a scandalous liaison with his half-sister that forced him to leave England altogether. To complicate matters further, he had been born with a crippled foot that was an early source of pain and shame, even as his precocious intelligence and his startling physical beauty led many admirers to pursue him sexually. And throughout his poetic career, Byron was preoccupied with a sense of being both unloved and unlovable, and of feeling like an exile from all that was good. So much for his male privilege.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.